Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Well, she's currently serving her 6th term in Congress. Prior to that, she was part of the California State Assembly. As a matter of fact, she made history as the first African-American woman to serve as Speaker in any U.S. legislative state body. And if you have any medical questions, she's also a physician's assistant. I am honored to be joined today by Congressmember Karen Bass. So lovely to have you here. I thought it was really fun that you had a medical background, by the way. I hope you don't mind that I said that.
Oh, not at all, not at all. And thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. You have been serving in Congress, as I mentioned, for this is your 6th term.
Mm-hmm.
How are things going there? How is the tone and tenor of politics in Washington right now?
Well, I will tell you, it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Okay.
There are issues that I know it will shock people that we work on in a bipartisan manner.
That's nice to hear.
But actually, since January 6th, it was a pretty profound change. I mean, the violence that happened at the Capitol that shook all of us has led to increased polarization. And so I think that part of it has been bad. But we do work on issues together. For example, one of the key issues I work on is trying to change the nation's child welfare system. And that's an issue that I work very closely with my Republican colleagues. I also focus on foreign policy. So when it comes to a lot of foreign policy issues, we do that in a bipartisan manner. It's just that what gets all of the attention is when we don't get along, not when we do get along.
Well, it's nice to hear that there is at least some movement towards working together. But I do actually, since you brought it up, I do want to just, because there has been so much about the insurrection on January 6th. Where were you and what happened with you on that day? And how do you perceive the whole thing? Because we're getting more and more and more stories coming out during the testimony. But you were, you're an integral and intimate part of that whole experience. What happened?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of my friends and family said, well, I know you're not going to go to the Hill, on January 6th because we know there's going to be protests. And I said to everyone, well, I'm not worried at all because I'm going to be in the safest building in the country. I'll be in the Capitol. I won't be outside on the street. I would have never imagined in 100 years that people would actually violate the Capitol. Because what I think that the general public doesn't realize is that the Capitol has been completely closed. There's no one there except for members of Congress when we're in session, and a lot of times we weren't because of the pandemic, and then also some of the staff, not all of the staff. So we felt completely safe, and then in a matter of minutes, now I was in the gallery, but I left just about 10 minutes before they broke through the barriers. I went to my office to do a Zoom call. And when I went to my office, I saw on the TV they had just broken in. If I had left 10 minutes later, I literally would have walked into them by accident, again, because nobody is in the Capitol. And so I had to shelter in place in my office. I did a Instagram Live, and a few minutes later, I had a knock on the door, and military is actually always in the building. And they told me to take my Instagram down. I didn't realize that they were actually hunting for us, and I had revealed my location. So they told us to take it down. So some of my colleagues that were there that had to be evacuated with the hoods put on, some of those members are still traumatized. They were there, they could hear the shot. They knew when the young woman was killed. And so many of them are still very traumatized. Now, we lost one Capitol Police officer that day and one of the protesters, but 3 Capitol Police officers committed suicide, one just a few days ago, because they have been so traumatized.
As a mother, there have been 2 incidents that I really feel may have changed whether it's going to be okay for my daughter to grow up in this country. And one was 9/11 and one was January 6th.
Right.
Do you think we can recover from what happened on that day?
Well, I do think we can recover, but what I'm really worried about is that January 6th was the beginning and the tip of the iceberg. So that's why it's so important for us to get to the bottom of what happened. And that's the investigation that's going on right now. That's the select committee that the Speaker formed that is going to investigate it right now.
Right. Well, there's so much to talk to you about, but top of mind, of course, is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which you introduced in February. It passed the House in March. Where is it now? Because, you know, Senate has gone into recess, has it not?
It's in purgatory, no.
Oh, no.
What has happened? No, the Senate is actually still in session
Okay.
because they're working out the bipartisan infrastructure deal.
Okay.
But the House of Representatives, my job was to get it out of the House. That job was finished on March 3rd, and it has been languishing in the Senate. Now, my two Senate partners, Senator Booker and Senator Scott, are working very hard to come to a deal. But what my concern is that a year plus later since the murder of George Floyd, the momentum is actually going in the other direction because crime has ticked up, which was completely predictable. So what I'm worried about is that the best time for us to have passed that bill was when there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street protesting and the momentum was there. Now all of that is gone. So I keep my fingers crossed. I'm in regular contact with my senator partners, but basically it has to pass the Senate. That's where we are right now.
And the main points in that bill that you feel most passionate about that really need to be addressed, what would you say they are?
It's the part of the bill that holds officers accountable, because I think all of us are tired of seeing these awful videos of people being brutalized and people being killed. And so we have to be able to hold officers accountable. We have to be able to prosecute them if they commit a crime. That lawsuits need to happen if they violate the law. Just think about it this way. Could you imagine if your doctor had no transparency and no accountability? He or she could basically do whatever, and there was nothing to hold them accountable. But I also think that the profession of policing needs to be uplifted. So part of the bill also calls for accreditation and training. Do you know that we have 18,000 police departments in the country and 18,000 ways of doing policing?
Right.
So in some cities, chokeholds are illegal. In other cities, they're fine. And so it's about uplifting the profession, creating standards. If you go get your hair done, the beautician that does your hair has to be accredited.
Yeah.
You would think that the profession that has the power to take away your freedom and take away your life, there should be a lot more accountability there. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is not anti-police. I actually think what has happened to policing over the last few decades is we have cut funding to health, social, and economic supports in communities, mental health, for example.
Yeah.
I think if a person decides to be a police officer, they're not going into policing so that they can deal with substance abuse and homelessness and mental illness. So when we remove the safety net from society and things fall through the cracks, we expect the police to come pick up the pieces. I don't think that's fair to them. So in addition, the bill also calls for grants to communities so communities can re-envision policing. Maybe in a community like ours, we need to have tremendous mental health infrastructure. Because just think about families who have no resort except for to call 911 because their family member is in a crisis.
Right.
I don't think you should call the police. I think you should call a social worker with the police as backup. And I don't think the police view it as their job. We shouldn't just leave society's problems to the police. We should take care of society's problems so police can focus on crime.
So if in fact it remains in purgatory, is there a way to pray it back to life the next time? Can you
Yes.
reintroduce it perhaps with some different, because the issues you're bringing up are not going to go away just because Congress and Senate are not in session. So are you going to re-bring it up if in fact it does not get passed?
Yes, that's actually the nature of Congress.
Right.
It's actually very unusual for a bill to be passed right away.
Okay.
I mean, we can work on issues for years. And what I always say is that Congress can take 10 days or 10 years to pass a piece of legislation. A lot of what determines the difference is the urgency that Congress feels, and then what creates that urgency? People on the streets, people contacting their representatives, people on the outside pressuring us on the inside. That's what makes us move. So I hope people keep pressuring us.
Well, it's interesting to know that, constituencies still have a say in what happens in government, because a lot of
Absolutely.
people, I would imagine, think that it's whatever you decide and not necessarily how we feel.
Oh,
So it's
no.
good to know that, that is very much still a part of the game. You mentioned the infrastructure bill, and that seems to have some bipartisan support,
Yes.
which is positive in a lot of ways. Directly here with the 37th, how will that help Los Angeles? What are some of the elements that we would actually see trickle down, even if it's in a while, that will help the infrastructure here in LA?
Well, first of all, Los Angeles and California, we didn't wait for Washington.
Good.
We went ahead and funded many infrastructure projects, but we need a lot more. I mean, one of the number one complaints in our city is traffic. And so resources that will help us build out our infrastructure for light rail and subways, all of that, being able to repair our streets. One of the things that I really like about the approach that's being taken is that we're viewing infrastructure broadly. So the fact that we still have lead pipes for water, I mean, everybody looked at the problem that happened in Michigan, but remember what happened in Flint with water and where the community had lead in their water for a very long time. That's really all around the country. If you look at the sewage lines, the water lines, etc. Now, the bill that's bipartisan is in the Senate. So I have not seen what is exactly in the bill because they're still negotiating it. And we are in recess, the House is, but the Senate isn't. And so I know that there will be lots of resources for Los Angeles. But that's one bill. The second bill is human infrastructure, looking at childcare, looking at education, looking at other parts of the infrastructure that we need to build out.
And that's been a passion of yours for a long time. In particular, you're talking about childcare, but you're also talking about foster youth and elevating people into a life that maybe has promise when maybe there wasn't that promise. So where are you in regards to all of those youth-focused issues that you have been a part of for such a long, long, long time?
Sure. Well, one is when I got to Congress, I formed a bipartisan caucus on foster youth called the Congressional Caucus on Foster Youth. A couple of years after being in Congress, I also started a nonprofit organization called the National Foster Youth Institute. That organization focuses on recruiting and training and developing young people who have aged out of the foster care system. That means they're 18 and above. And we bring 100 of them to Washington every year from 100 different congressional districts. And we have them there for a week. We train them about the legislative process. We tell them how to take their personal story and translate it into policy. And then we have them shadow their member of Congress. And what has happened over the years is that members of Congress have developed long-term relationships with these young people. And the young people realize that they're the experts that have told us what type of legislation needs to take place. So, for example, when COVID hit, no one really thought about foster youth.
No.
So when the order was given for all of the students to go home from dormitories, what about those students that didn't have homes to go to? What about the young people that were aging out of foster care that then didn't have social workers or even still in the system? So the young people in the National Foster Youth Institute called us on the carpet and said, you need to think about us. And so they proposed very specific pieces of legislation that we passed. One of the young individuals, unfortunately, did catch COVID and passed away.
Oh, no.
And so we named a piece of legislation after him. And that's a bill that will allow foster youth to have the Affordable Care Act if they change states. So if you're a foster youth from California and you decide to go to Arizona State, your health care is cut off. It was a mistake in the Affordable Care Act that needed to be fixed. And so we've named that DJ's Law after the young man that lost his life.
Unrelated, but interesting to me. Why is it possible for there to be bipartisan support for some issues and impossible for others? Where is it that shuts things down? What is it that shuts things down?
So I think two things. One are ideological issues, which I'll address in a minute, and the other are campaigns. So, for example, some of my colleagues do not believe in a woman's right to choose. And so typically then they don't want to get into any issues related to reproductive health, including I don't support abortion, but I'm also not going to provide contraception. So that is an ideological issue where people just disagree. When it comes to an issue like crime, for example, is more political. So a member of Congress is worried that if they support police reform or if they support criminal justice reform, they might be viewed as soft on crime, and their opponent might wage a campaign against them for being soft on crime. So I would divide it that way. One is political and the other is ideological. But there are some areas where as a matter of fact, I tend to work with people who are against choice, but they believe in adoption. And so that's where we can agree. And those tend to be my Republican colleagues that I work with on foster care. So I think it's very important to try to identify issues and to try to talk about the issues in a way that unites people. You can always talk about things in a polarizing way.
Sure.
But there are ways to talk about and to build consensus. Some of the criminal justice reform bills I have bipartisan support for. I'm working on a bill right now that provides grants to communities to help people when they are released from prison.
Oh.
So, for example, in California, we're releasing a lot of people, but we don't have a real strong infrastructure set up to reintegrate those individuals back into the communities after they're released, and then we're surprised when they reoffend. So California has had a very high recidivism rate. I'm not exactly sure what it is now. Hopefully it's improved. But it used to be close to 70% of prisoners were incarcerated again within a year or two.
Well, and your point is so valid because the issue is, what are the alternatives? I mean, if there are no alternatives for, mental health providers in a crisis situation, if there are no alternatives for somebody coming out of jail or prison, where are they going to go? Or if there's no alternative to where can you put someone who may have committed a minor crime, but a prison sentence is not an appropriate place. There has to be some alternative. So it's nice to hear that is a focus of attention to create those alternatives.
And what we have done over the years, and I think politicians have done this, and I'm a politician, so I can say that, people are so concerned about their reelection that they pass laws that to be as punitive as possible. So in the state of California, when I was in the legislature, we banned people who were formerly incarcerated from being able to be licensed in 56 different occupations. And I'll tell you the craziest one. In state prison, we teach people to be barbers, but then we don't allow people that have been in prison to have a barbering license.
Oh, dear.
So we were able to change that, but that's an example. So during the years of getting tough on crime, we passed more and more and more punitive laws and didn't realize that we were essentially banning people from working. Mm-hmm. Well, if you can't work in the legal economy, what do you think you're going to do?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You are extremely important, and you've been a role model for a lot of people.
Thank you.
How are things for women and women of color in positions of power? Is it improving? Are you watching your constituency and you're watching those that you work with rise up in the ranks? Are they facing are they not having to face some of the issues that you had to face? Is it getting better in that regard?
I think it absolutely is getting better. And, again, fortunate to come from Los Angeles and California, that's a much more progressive-minded state. Some of my colleagues who come from more conservative states have more challenges. But look who's at the helm. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who is essentially, over the 4 years of the last administration, kept our government afloat. And when the history book is written on the Trump years, it will lift up the fact that she played the most significant leadership role in the U.S. government. So having a role model like that, and then the Democratic caucus, there's a lot of women, so I feel very, very strong. There's always the minor incidences, but as women, we will always push back, but we also get used to it and know that it's going to happen.
Well, that's positive. Okay. So there's also a lot of issues with inclusion, and I'm speaking to that a little bit now, but also how are those playing out across Congress? What are some of the things that maybe people haven't necessarily heard because they're not front page news, they're not as controversial, that are being put into place that will help with equanimity and inclusion?
Well, you know what? The most exciting thing on that account is an administration that put equity and inclusion front and center in his inauguration speech. And having somebody like Ambassador Susan Rice, who's the director of Domestic Policy Council, and she's the one that's in charge of looking at all of the various agencies in the federal government to make sure that they are addressing equity and inclusion. And we've made sure that the bills that we passed, the resources that went out, we tried to pay attention to those individuals and sectors that fall through the cracks, like minority businesses and all. And in the infrastructure package, equity and inclusion is front and center as well.
Okay. And there are some issues that I didn't even realize that you have been very much a strong proponent of. All right. I didn't know that there was a concern with the separation of Korean families. You know, people who may have immigrated to the United States and are legal citizens have not had any contact with their relatives in North Korea, et cetera. So what is that bill? Or is it a bill or is it an
yes,
okay?
it is
And how does that work and how will that help?
Sure. Well, I represented Koreatown when I was first in Congress, and I lived in Koreatown. I've always been close to Koreatown, and I met with some constituents that told me that they were from South Korea, obviously. They had family in North Korea that they hadn't seen since the war. And then an older gentleman came and met with me. It was so sad. He was in tears in my office. He was in his 80s, and he was so afraid that he wasn't going to live long enough to see his family members. Well, we don't want people to go to North Korea in the United States. And so the point of my bill is to say, okay, that's fine, but for Korean Americans who have family in North Korea, we need to do everything we can to try to reunite them. And so that's essentially what it is saying, is that we want the government to waive that to allow families to be reunited.
And then also I was excited to see, will there be a Muslim American Heritage Month?
Yes, there'll be a Muslim American Heritage Month. We now have 3 or 4 members of Congress that are Muslim.
And what can we look forward to? What will that mean? That'll just mean an opportunity to celebrate
Yes, it's more ceremonial, but it's also done because of all of the anti-Muslim rhetoric over the last few years. And so to lift up and acknowledge the Muslim American community and to have that Heritage Month, what that will do is that people will speak and acknowledge, and it just lifts up their presence.
A child of Los Angeles, as I said, physician's assistant, you were a community advocate, you created COCOs, a nonprofit, you moved to the state assembly, now at Congress. What prompted that trajectory? Because it seemed like you were going one way, kind of turned another way, and then you went on a very strong path in one way.
No, it's actually always been one consistent path, and I did not view my life as a trajectory or as a career. I always have been involved in politics and community activities, community activism.
Yeah.
I just didn't do it as a job. So my day job was working at LA County Hospital in the emergency room, and then I also was a part of the faculty at USC Medical School. But at night, on the weekends, I was in the community participating in other community projects. And in 1990, when I started Community Coalition, it was the first time I was paid to do what I had always done for free.
So who did you look up to? Who were your role models? Where did you know that this was something that you could and should and want to do?
Well, I think it happened to be the time period in which I grew up, in the 60s and 70s when the whole world was changing, and I was certainly swept up in that and wanting to be a part of that. And so along the way, I've just had so many role models, so many people. Even when I was in high school and middle school, there were a lot of activist parents who then worked with us as teenagers. That's why when I started Community Coalition, one of the first things we did was started a youth component called South Central Youth in Action. And it's actually their 30th anniversary this year.
Oh.
And so some of the young people that we recruited who were 14 and 15 years old, they're now participating in a reunion this year. That's right. And a few of them still work there. They grew up, graduated college, started families, and are now working at Community Coalition. So I've just always believed that real change is always led historically by young people. And since adults took care of me and walked me along this path when I was 13, 14 years old, I've always been committed to that. And then because I believe that social change and social justice goes on, you have to fight for it forever. It's critically important that we pay attention to the next generation of leaders. And one of the things I was most proud of was to leave Community Coalition and to pass the baton to Marquise Harris Dawson, who is now a member of City Council. And he passed the baton to Alberto Ratana. So it's really important to pay attention to that next generation of leadership and nurture them and support them.
You heard this before we actually started to film, and so I just been curious how you felt when you heard it. That yes, you do have a life of politics, but you have a reputation of action and actually doing things and not just talking about them. How did that feel when you heard that? And is that where you put yourself?
That's the highest compliment you could give me, because to me it really is about what I can do to make a difference in people's lives. It's not about the pomp and circumstance. It's not about the glory. I'm still trying to find the glory. I haven't found it yet. Because these jobs are hard work. And I think that a lot of times people think that what elected officials do is run around to events and all of that. And that is a necessary part of the job. But the job is getting legislation done that actually impacts people, not symbolic legislation, but legislation that makes a difference.
And how can we help you? How can your constituency help you? How can the community at large help you? How obviously support you politically, but what can we do? What can the average person do to make things work?
Well, you know, the constituents help me all the time. They make sure that I know about certain issues. They will even call me up and say, there's bill number XYZ. How come you're not co-sponsoring it? Right. And I appreciate that. And what I tell them is, you know, including the Senate, there's 535 of us and thousands of bills. So it's important when constituents point out what legislation they support and bring it to my attention, because most of the time I'm just not aware of it because the volume is so high.
Sure.
So if it's not on the committee that I'm on, chances are I won't know. So people tell me the issues. They hold me accountable. I try to have town hall meetings all the time. As a matter of fact, I've missed the in-person one, you know, so I do the Zoom or telephone town halls. But I think that the average person thinks that their civic responsibility is to vote. I would say that's just the beginning of their civic responsibility. Be involved with your elected officials. Tell them what you want. Don't expect them to read your mind and be mad because they haven't done something you wanted and you haven't necessarily talked to them. But call our office, engage with us, and then, of course, help us when it comes to fighting for legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So everybody should be calling their senators.
Exactly. And if it comes back next time, it won't have the same name, though, will it?
Right. It just depends. Okay. If the two senators decide to keep the name, they might change it.
Okay. And what are you going to do on your break?
I am talking to my constituents, all awesome. Involved. When we take these breaks, they're not vacations.
There's no breaks.
No.
And when you come back into session, what's your first thing?
My first thing is I'm going to stay with my senators for that bill, but also I'm moving my criminal justice legislation.
Which is?
The bill that will provide the grants to communities.
Oh.
You know what I really want to do with this bill is I really want to make sure that the funding goes to people who were formerly incarcerated. Because we've locked them out of the legal economy, a lot of formerly incarcerated people start their own nonprofits and they need assistance, they need resources. And then what they do is that they help reintegrate people because they know what it's like. So I'm hoping that after the legislation is signed by the president, then I have to continue to fight to make sure the money really hits the streets.
Right. And finally, we don't have any time whatsoever, but I am curious, how do you see Los Angeles right now? Where are we in your mind's eye?
Well, you know, there's so many wonderful things about our city, but we do have these huge problems. Coming here and driving past all of the people that are sleeping on the streets. I mean, to me, it's a humanitarian crisis. You know, I've traveled to refugee camps in Africa, and some of the refugee camps look better than what I see on our streets.
Well, I wish you could stay for the rest of the day, but I know that you are dearly wanted in other places. But it's been a true honor. And if people want to get more information about what you're doing in Congress and in general, how can they reach out?
Absolutely. They can go to Rep. Karen Bass, R.E.P. Karen Bass. They can call my office, 323-965-1422, and look forward to hearing your input.
I really do mean this. It's been an honor and a privilege to spend this time with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Likewise.
And that's a wrap on this LA Current.